Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. This time around, we're talking about something that should be as basic in a healthy society as clean air and decent internet speeds: a free press. Unfortunately, in certain parts of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet sphere, independent journalism isn't just on life support. It's trapped in the basement, gagged, and forced to watch propaganda on loop until it taps out. And if you think I'm being dramatic, I'd love to sell you one of those lush, thriving independent media landscapes currently on display, except I can't because they barely exist anymore, especially when we're talking about Russia. So instead, let's take a look at Vladimir Putin's Propagandify Wrapped, his yearly, totally not scripted press conference.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has returned to one of his favorite topics, his newest toy, the Oreshnik missile. He claims that this weapon cannot be stopped by any Western air or missile defense systems. It is being presented as an absolute game changer in the war in Ukraine. The Russian leader seems to want to come across as confident as possible in this new creation, which is why he has offered the West this challenge.
Let's
say a high-tech duel of the 21st century. Let them determine some object to be destroyed, say in Kiev, to concentrate all their air defense and missile defense forces there. And we will strike there and see what happens.
These scraps are purported to be the remains of the Oreshnik, which was used to strike the city of Dnipro a few weeks ago. The use of these weapons is to go beyond just a war in Ukraine, however. The Russians want to deploy this weapon to Belarus, an idea which has been very warmly welcomed by Belarusian despot Alexander Lukashenko. This decision is yet another step in the arms race currently going on around the war in Ukraine. It comes in the wake of the US and other allies allowing Kiev to strike Russian territory with the weapons they have provided. And as for the other types of equipment, well, President Zelensky is confident in their capabilities versus the Oreshnik.
The world has air defense systems capable of defending against such things. We need to focus on this, all of us.
Though, of course, it is highly unlikely that anyone will agree to any sort of duel above Kiev skies, as a result of which innocents may be hurt.
And now let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. In Russia, the concept of a truly independent press has been systematically dismantled like a Jenga tower made of toothpicks. Independent outlets are labeled foreign agents, journalists face harassment, and those who dare step out of line can be threatened, attacked, or even killed. It's a scenario that makes working as a journalist feel like you're perpetually staring at a noir thriller with a terrible script. But Russia is unfortunately just the most high-profile example. Belarus, Azerbaijan, and several other neighbors have been honing similar methods, often testing the limits of how blatantly they can silence critics without provoking too much international condemnation, or at least condemnation that actually matters. What's astonishing is that in some places, censorship isn't always achieved through brute force, though that never goes fully out of style, but through a more subtle or insidious means. Governments will quietly scoop up media outlets using friendly oligarchs as proxies, turning once hopeful editorial boards into glorified PR teams. Or they'll starve independent media of advertising revenue by pressuring businesses not to associate with undesirable publications. The result? A once vibrant press scene reduced to a bland monochromatic chorus of praise singers. Sometimes they deploy legislative wizardry that would make Harry Potter's head spin. New laws criminalizing disinformation are passed with definitions that remain conveniently fuzzy. And next thing you know, journalists face criminal charges for reporting on protests or raising uncomfortable questions about corruption. Investigative reporters are locked up, fined into oblivion, or left scrambling to publish their pieces from exile. In places like Belarus, the picture is as grim as you might expect. Leader Alexander Lukashenko, the mustachioed maestro of political repression, has treated free media like a misbehaving child, sent them to their room, denied them supper, and occasionally threatened to kick them out of the house altogether. Independent journalists there operate in a climate of fear, and simply attending a public event with a camera can earn you a one-way ticket to a cell. The authorities have turned public discourse into a sculpted garden of perfectly trimmed hedges, where every leaf points in the direction the government prefers, and every weed or journalist who tries to poke through the cracks is swiftly yanked out. The biggest tragedy here isn't just the lack of a free press, it's what that absence does to societies. Without independent journalists, citizens are left to guess and gossip, filling in the blanks with rumors, whispers, and whatever the state press choose to spoon-feed. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Rasmus Nielsen, a lecturer from University College London. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So today we are trying to unpack the super down-to-earth, absolutely genuine, and definitely not scripted press conference of Vladimir Putin. Now, can you give us a little bit of rundown on what kind of message is he trying to, send out, and what kind of person he's trying to portray himself as?
Well, so there are really more general messages with these events, and then there are specific messages coming out from the event we saw yesterday. So in general, to have these events, Vladimir Putin has them in order to show to some extent, his approachability for the population at large in Russia, but also his command of facts, his command of the situation, and he's done so pretty much throughout his tenure as Russia's president. He likes to use events like this to try and show himself as, if you like, master of ceremonies, but also to play a bit on that old trope of the good Tsar, you know, the autocratic leader, the centralizing leader who's still very much ready and willing to listen to ordinary people's complaints and concerns. If we're looking at what he was trying to get out yesterday in particular, well, he was trying to say that everything is okay, that the war in Ukraine is going as expected, even better than that, and that although there are some difficulties for ordinary people in Russia, socioeconomic difficulties, these are temporary, these will be overcome, these are under control. These were his domestic messages. He was also, however, sending an international message, particularly to the incoming American administration, a message which stated that Russia is willing to do a deal in Ukraine. It's willing to be reasonable as long as its interests are being respected. Unlike it was more than implied, unlike those Ukrainians who really just want to continue a hopeless fight.
Right, everything's going well, the economy is good, the inflation is only transitory. Like you also mentioned earlier, he's also trying to give out a vibe of approachability, which for the Western world seems kind of absurd. But I'm wondering if what's your take when it comes to the domestic consumption? Are they in such a media bubble that it's actually effective within Russia, or do you think that at some point the message we'll see a crack within the messaging?
Well, there are several audiences for this messaging. If you're looking at the Russian population at large, they are fully aware that there are socioeconomic difficulties, and there are still fears about a new general mobilization coming up. Now, the fears may be slightly less than they were before, but they are there. So I would say that that sort of media image has cracked if you're looking at the broader population. And in order to control that broader population, the regime therefore has to use quite a lot of fear and quite a lot of sort of harder controls in its place. So that's the general population. But Putin is also sending a message to the Russian elites and to the Russian bureaucracy stating that, look, Putin, I am still in charge. I can still control these things. You will all still be able to keep your places. And if you're part of the elite, you will all still be able to earn good money in Russia as long as you do not challenge me, as long as you do not doubt me. And then, of course, finally, we should also remember that as an old man, Putin is very much talking to himself. And that audience, I'm afraid, remains quite convinced of his message.
And another thing that I've observed, well, of course, Putin does do this on an annual basis, and most of the time these messaging are aimed at its domestic population. But this time around, we see a little bit of change of messaging, and some are speculating that perhaps this time it's also more targeting towards people in the West. Do you also observe this kind of messaging that is trying to also approach the Western countries more than just domestic?
Yes, I mean, I think you're quite right. As I indicated before, definitely a core audience for this, for his appearance yesterday, Putin's appearance, a core audience is the incoming American administration. Trump presents himself as a deal maker, and in order to show that image and have that image confirmed, Trump wants some big, quick wins once he comes into power. Now, one such win, one very sort of high-profile win, could be in the war in Ukraine. And Putin is basically saying to Trump, look, I'm willing to give you this win as long as you respect my wishes, respect my interests, and as long as you understand, Mr. Trump, that these sorts of cases should be negotiated between the real great powers, that is, your America, my Russia, and not involve, the pesky Ukrainians or even the Europeans. Putin is also trying to reach out, although less so, to European audiences, such as, for instance, in connection with the German election coming up, in connection with otherwise dissatisfied populations in Europe who may not wish to continue sending money to Ukrainian defense. So Putin is reaching that way too, but he sees first and foremost his external audience as being in the US. There is perhaps also, it's worth saying, a side order of an audience in China. I mean, Putin is not very worried about losing Chinese support for his war, but on the other hand, he does understand that he has to show some progress in order to keep the Chinese actively on board. So there's a little bit of that audience too.
Right. How effective do you think that message is being received in the Western world? We can see on our screen here, and well, we've also looked at some of the absurdities of these press conferences. Do you think that the messaging actually can go through and at least achieve any amount of effect that he wanted to?
I don't think there are many people in the West now, and not necessarily that many in Russia either, but certainly not in the West, who see Putin as a very strong leader, or a leader who is stronger after he conducted the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Now, Putin himself, of course, said yesterday that Russia now is stronger now than before 2022, and you can't really find people in the West who would accept that, and that includes Trump. Nonetheless, what you can find are people in the West who are tired of the war and who might want to see in Putin a dictator with whom we can do business, so to speak. Now, again, that is Putin's bet, particularly when it comes to his relations with the Americans, that the Americans will move towards into international isolationism to some extent and into a very transactional behavior, which is, of course, what Trump is known for. And in that context, I think that Putin's message may land reasonably well in America. Now, don't get me wrong, Trump will still look to make the deal that's best for him personally, but he would like the Russian problem, so to speak, or the Ukrainian problem as well, to be solved in a way that both absolves America from any obligations in future or minimizes those obligations, but also shows Trump as a man who can get deals done. And in that context, Putin's appearance yesterday may still work.
So now we have a relatively good idea on how much of this messaging is being received domestically and perhaps in foreign countries. You also brought attention to one aspect that I do find really interesting, that being the elites within the Russian bureaucracy. Do you think on that front, well, being so much entrenched in their own bubble and messaging, this would actually send a message to them and have an effective result when it comes to these messaging?
Well, as far as I see the situation inside Russia, there is a growing problem. On the one hand, with his messaging yesterday and otherwise, Putin is still able to send out a signal of strength to the elite in Russia. After what happened to someone like Yevgeny Prigozhin, the elite in Russia are not, as I see it, in a position to challenge Putin directly for power. What they can do, however, is, and what they are doing, is challenging each other's for the funds and for the assets that can still be taken out of the Russian economy. And here the thing I think to look out for is that a lot of people in Russia now are earning good money on a wartime economy. They're earning good money on military production and production otherwise related to military affairs. Now, if Putin at some point, and perhaps some point soon, starts having to turn his economy back towards producer goods, towards consumer goods for ordinary Russians, then that may hurt the economic interests of parts of the elites that have now invested so heavily in the last couple of years and earned so good money on the war. And those elites, while they may not be ready to go out and voice their dissatisfaction by attacking Putin directly, they could well start scrapping more and more intensely among themselves for whatever funds are left to take out of war action. Also, of course, if the state starts putting more and more money now into consumer goods and into general production, then you will see elites fighting over getting funds and getting kickbacks for that. In fact, as a more general point, what I see gradually developing in Russia is a situation to some extent going back towards the 1990s. That is, we're not looking at a Russia that will move toward collapse, but we may be looking towards a Russia that will become more and more difficult to centralize, a Russia in which different elites will challenge each other more and more. Not the central state, perhaps, but they will go for each other, sometimes with quite violent results.
Right, so a lot going into this whole press conference thing. Do you think at the end of the day, the most effective result might be the targeting of those, like you mentioned earlier, that are, or we're already seeing a little bit of war fatigue kicking in and do want to see this war in Ukraine essentially wind down?
Yeah, I mean, following from that argument, if we look over the coming 2 or 3 months, I mean, particularly after Trump gets into the White House in January, it will be interesting to see to what extent the West and perhaps particularly Europe can keep up its support for Ukraine and will be willing to keep up its support for Ukraine. Obviously, we also have to keep an eye out for the continued societal strength inside Ukraine. I would say, though, no matter what Putin says now, and even if, a peace or an armistice was to come tomorrow, do not expect tensions between Putin's Russia and the West to go away anytime soon. It is there for the long term. I mean, the regime in Russia has moved itself into a corner, and I cannot see how any responsible Western government, or certainly any responsible European government, will be able to find any level of meaningful normalization with the Russia we have today. That Russia would have to change fundamentally in its political and social culture for Europe to do meaningful long-term business with it again.
All right. And last but not least, how long did you think Vladimir Putin practiced for his karaoke bit?
I beg your pardon?
I was just kidding. I was asking, how long do you think Putin practiced for his karaoke bit?
I'm so sorry. I wasn't expecting that question. Well, he does have a little bit of a history singing in public. I seem to recall a rather brave, I think that's the word to use, a rather brave rendition of Blueberry Hills by Fats Domino some years back. Look, I will criticize Mr. Putin for many, many things. I think he is in so many ways a terrible leader. His singing ability, I won't criticize him for, not I anyway. Others are better qualified to do so.
All right. Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
Thank you.
Cheers. And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. A shootout in the parliament of the breakaway Georgian region of Abkhazia has left one lawmaker wounded and another dead. The incident took place during a session concerning a cryptocurrency bill.
Vakhtan Golanja had tried to separate two lawmakers who had gotten into a very heated argument. The dispute turned violent and led to a shootout. Adgur Karazia, the lawmaker currently suspected of perpetrating the shooting, has reportedly fled the scene. Reports not indicate that he had had any motive for his actions. The incident may be related to the wider turmoil currently affecting the Russian-supported breakaway region. Last month, Abkhazia was thrown into a crisis as protesters stormed the parliament building in opposition to an investment agreement with Russia. Opposition leaders and the protesters themselves were concerned that the deal would lead to wealthy Russians buying up property in the region and pricing out local residents.
Russia is planning to build a road to connect Crimea with the Rostov region. The route would run through occupied Ukrainian territories such as Mariupol and Melitopol.
The Rostov region will be a focal part of Vladimir Putin's plan to rebuild the areas his forces had laid waste to during his war in Ukraine. Rostov plays a vital role in supplying Russia's troops on the front lines, and the ring road running through it could bolster this function. The road, planned to be finished by around 2030, will also run through the territories that Russia took over during the invasion of Ukraine. This includes the city of Mariupol, which is considered by many to be the symbol of Russian savagery and brutality during the war. Swaths of the city had been reduced to rubble, and hundreds of people were killed in what was a particularly brutal siege. The main purpose of this route, however, is to offer better connection between the illegally annexed Crimea and the Russian mainland. Crimea will also be connected to Rostov-on-Don via railway, which is meant to serve as an alternative to the Kerch Bridge.
Approximately a quarter of Russian malls are facing pre-bankruptcy conditions and are at risk of being closed in 2025. Now, this is according to a report from industry leaders published by Russian media on the state of the country's economy.
The dire situation affecting Russian malls stems from a variety of factors. These include the departure of major foreign companies in the wake of Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, rising operation costs, and growing competition from online marketplaces. Vladimir Putin himself has admitted that Western sanctions have had an impact on the Russian economy in his annual end-of-the-year press conference, though he tried to quickly draw attention to other problems he considered more important in regards to the state of the economy. These include the shortcomings of the Russian authorities in combating inflation. Putin says that the soaring inflation rates are being driven by supply not keeping up with demand and the rising prices of certain products across the globe. Several experts have also linked Russia's mounting defense spending to growing inflation, pointing out that a wartime economy is exacting a heavy toll on ordinary Russians.
Russia is relocating its air defense systems from Syria to Libya in the wake of the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime, according to U.S. and Libyan officials. They will be deployed in regions controlled by Russia-backed warlord Khalifa Haftar.
Recent flight data reveals heightened Russian military transport activity. Russia holds two important bases in Syria, one naval and one air base. Both are vital to Moscow's interests in the Mediterranean region and in Africa. Reports indicate that Russian cargo planes have already transported air defense systems such as the S-400s and the S-300s. They will be relocated to bases in eastern Libya. An unnamed US official has said that it is currently unclear whether these systems will remain in Libya or be sent back to Russia. The Russian naval base in Tartus, Syria, is particularly important, not only for Russian designs for the Middle East and Africa, but also because it is the Russian Navy's sole replenishment and repair point in the Mediterranean. Russian officials have confirmed that Moscow is currently in talks with the rebel group which ousted Assad concerning the future of Russian bases.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.